Welcome to the fourth episode. It is the fourth episode, right?
Why is it the fourth episode, the 5-year gap? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, the fourth episode of Maester Monthly, your favorite pseudo-monthly podcast hosted by the moderators of the Song of Ice and Fire subreddit. I am Michael, better known around the subreddit as Bookshelfstud.
And I am Glass Table Girl, also Eliana. These are names of me.
I'm JoeMagician, also known as Matt.
And today we are joined by a special intruder. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, intruder?
Hello, I am Jeff, better known as BryndenBfish. I am back for another guest spot. I don't know why I was invited back, but I'm here, and I'm here to do as much damage to this podcast as is possible before I leave.
Absolutely. We're really excited for that. Today, as always, we're going to talk about some of our favorite posts from the last month or so, the nicest catches and hottest topics. We will, of course, once again have a Thunderdome of ideas in the great Greco-Roman tradition of discourse. Our topic for the day is going to be the 5-year gap, whether or not George should have done it, all that kind of stuff. But before we jump into all of these very exciting features, I wanted to ask everybody a question. Inspired by a recent thread by Rowan Dane, what is, in your opinion, the most messed up ASOIAF chapter? Matt, what would you say is, in your opinion, the most messed up?
The Dance with Dragons prologue where you meet Varamir Sixskins and all the really, really terrible things he does to everyone around him. He starts off talking about how he's responsible for the death of his brother, how he's eaten the heart of his mentor, how he shakes down communities for women, and then he rounds it off by trying to do human warging, which is the stuff of nightmares.
Yeah.
Where the woman bites off her own tongue and claws out her own eyes to stop Varamir from taking control of her body.
You also left off one of those things that just kind of really messes with me now, being a relatively recent father, is where he, as a wolf, eats the baby,
yes.
Saves the baby for last.
Oh, yeah.
That was pretty horrific for me.
The whole thing's out of control. I mean, it's supposed to be an info dump by George to tell you, all the warging stuff that's going on, and, oh, by the way, Bran's doing this, and he's terrible, too. But just reading it, it's like a horror movie.
Him giving us all that horror up front about warging and all that means that later on when you see Bran skin-changing Hodor, you're like, oh no, it's that Varamir chapter again. So Eliana, what's your most messed up chapter?
I think I'm gonna go with what might be the basic answer here, but the Forsaken, spoilers, Winds of Winter, Aaron's sample chapter, it's just suddenly you see the enormity of what people have to deal with regarding Euron, but it's also at the same time kind of like Train Spotting, and maybe like Requiem for a Dream, but I'd never watched that movie, so I don't actually know. But it's like a really bad drug trip, which is literally what it is.
Right.
Because it's all induced by the shade of the evening and just being forced to consume things and then figuring out the enormity of what Euron forces people to do in general.
Some of the listeners might not know, but a lot of us actually got to listen to George read that chapter for the first time live, and the amount of emotion, the different ways that he did the voices, really emphasized the horror of it, the way he did the prophecy bits and all the gods that are staked to the Iron Throne. This is really messed up, but incredibly compelling at the same time. So it was the best of both worlds for me.
Yeah, it definitely seared it into your memory. I don't know, in that dark room with him on the stage and everything, extra creepy.
Sounds like it would have been pretty fun to be there and listen to.
Oh yeah, wish you'd been there.
It was a lot of fun.
Was it? Oh, weird.
Maybe next. Well, probably not.
Probably never.
And that's really why it's the most messed up chapter, because Matt wasn't able to make it.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's true.
That's kind of sweet. Thank you.
So Jeff, what's your answer?
So it's interesting that everyone picked different things so far that are horrific, just kind of a huge meta sense. For me, the most terrible, awful, messed up chapter in A Song of Ice and Fire is a chapter that maybe some of you guys don't know who are listening, but it's Tyrion's 6th chapter from A Dance with Dragons. And this is fresh on my mind because a few weeks ago I was recording a podcast with the Game of Bones podcast, and we were talking about this chapter. This chapter itself was horrific because it was very personal to Tyrion. And the reason why it was awful and messed up was because that Tyrion was conscious of the evil, awful, horrible things that he was doing, and he still did it anyways. He didn't do it just once. He did it twice. And what I'm referring to is at the very end of the chapter, Tyrion goes to this brothel in Sahoris outside of Atlantis, and he asks for a Westerosi woman, a Westerosi prostitute, and they provide him one that looks vaguely Westerosi but doesn't really speak or say anything. He has sex with her, and then he realizes that he has this whole thing that he thinks that he had sex with a corpse. And then he says, okay, that's awful. Let me do it again, sort of thing. And that to me was just like one of those moments where I went, man, I don't think that Tyrion's necessarily the hero of this story. Like, this is like some really villainous type stuff. Even in my first read of the story, where I was like, Tyrion's a good guy because I've seen Peter Dinklage and up to season 2 at that time. But it's really not the case that he's the hero at this point in A Dance of Dragons, and maybe he never was the hero. And that's what kind of got me into thinking that tracking Tyrion's progress through the books, you don't see a lot of heroic arcs. You see things that you appreciate and admire, but this moment here reinforces that there's a dark undertone to Tyrion's story, which is really cool, but it's really messed up too.
Yeah, I think it adds to it that it's Tyrion who we've been with since book 1. We first meet him reading in the library, like he's very sympathetic. So to see him that dark, that's disturbing.
It was, I think, like after A Clash of Kings, right? George R. R. Martin does an interview, or he's like doing a talk somewhere, and there he explicitly calls Tyrion a villain of the story, as early as book 2, when we as the reader aren't like necessarily paying attention to things that he's doing, and we're kind of still seeing him heroically.
Yeah, right.
Right. We're rooting for him still, even at the juncture in the story that we're at by the end of A Dance with Dragons and into the Winds of Winter, the 2 chapters that we've either George has read or he's released. We're still rooting for him to survive, right? But at the same time, like, yeah, George said he's the villain after all. I'm not sure we've quite reached rock bottom for Tyrion yet. I think there's still some terrible things to come, and I'll be curious to see what George does in Winds, especially since he has said that Daenerys and Tyrion will intersect in some way at some point in the book.
Right.
So that if Tyrion's still in this really, really dark place, and not that he was ever a good person to begin with, but he's in a much worse place than he was even in The Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords.
In that, it's not a blog post, I think, and George talks about wanting to write a character or a villain who rivals Walter White from Breaking Bad. And I personally think that when he talks about that, he means Tyrion, because it's a similar situation, right? You have this protagonist, people are following this anti-hero, and turns out maybe they're not doing such good things.
Right.
So does that make Penny Skylar in the books?
Or Shay?
Or Shay, yeah.
Stop selling weed to my Tyrion.
He sells blue. He sells Shade of the Evening.
Oh, snap. New tinfoil.
Oh my God.
The exact terminology that George used in that quote is that there is nobody in Westeros specifically that is as bad as Walter White. So the question is, does he mean A Song of Ice and Fire in general when he says Westeros, or does he mean the continent of Westeros?
That's a great point. You don't know. I would imagine he means A Song of Ice and Fire, but it could be that he's being tricky, because George is a very tricky guy when it comes to these types of discussions, where he does kind of shroud some of his meaning in almost doublespeak, so to speak.
I just want to let everyone know, though, this other voice that y'all are hearing, that's Aaron.
No, I'm going to cut myself. It's fine.
No,
don't cut yourself. That's good stuff.
Discussion and addition. Everyone, that was Aaron. He's
beautiful.
He's been here before. Y'all have heard him. He's AdmiralKird.
My most disturbing chapter. I'm going to have to go with the classic answer that I think pops up a lot, and definitely popped up a lot before the Forsaken was around and sort of dethroned it. But Brienne getting her face eaten by Biter. Just because we spend so much of that book with Brienne on this sort of hopeless quest, and then you get to this end chapter, and she has this showdown with the Bloody Mummers, and she kills Rorge. It's great, this cool fight. And then immediately she gets her face eaten off by Biter. That's just, it undercuts so much any possible good resolution to Brienne's story.
One of the things about the chapter that's really cool, and I think that reinforces something about George being a romantic at heart, is that it doesn't end with Brienne dying this horrible death of being eaten alive. It ends with Brienne looking up at Biter and thinking that he has a really long tongue. It almost looks like a sword. which it was, but it's a really cool way that George talks about like the horror and this kind of realistic world, but you still have goodness and hope, at least in that moment that's there.
Brienne saved the orphans, and it's more complicated than just Brienne died. Unlike, say, Quentin, who was burned to death in his final point of view chapter. Burned to shreds.
To shreds, you say?
Is that how burning works?
It can. I mean, with dragon fire or furnace breath.
Depends on the temperature at which leather burns.
Yeah, it's really important. There were a lot of great posts over the last month or so, as there always are on the subreddit. Eliana, why don't you get us started? What was one of your favorite posts from the last month or so?
25 days ago by user Lemon Peely. It's discussing and asks the subreddit, what to you are the strongest themes present in the books? And this is a question that really interests me as someone who tries to look at the books in terms of like, what is this saying about the human experience? Because these books are so successful since they speak to a lot of people's different experiences, right?
Yeah.
And Lemon Peely asserts in the OP these 4 themes, and then lets everyone else suggest their own. The first one that they suggest is war is hell, and they say this notion is present in almost every element of the books, from Arya's journey in Storm, Brienne and Jaime's travels in Feast, especially the broken man speech from Septon Maribald, mounting tensions in King's Landing, etc., etc. The next one that they suggest is honor. What is honor? What does it mean to be a true knight? And how do you reconcile honor with vows?
Spicy.
The third one that they suggest is exploring the effects of a heavily patriarchal and toxically masculine society on both men and women. And they say the point that George R. R. Martin makes very successfully, they feel, is that toxic masculinity, i.e. the notion that to be strong is to be violent and that masculine traits are inherently positive and feminine ones are inherently negative, is damaging to everyone, not just women. And you can see these in the effects on characters like Sam, Bran, Jaime, and Barristan. And then the last one that they suggest is that the feudal system kind of sucks, guys. It's in all caps, so I just wanted to stress that. Kind of sucks, guys! And that they firmly believe that the Iron Throne will be destroyed in the end, or whoever manages to get it will do so at the cost of everything else. Then they say, democracy for Westeros!
So one of the things that they make is the point that war is hell, and that is very, very true in the story. But George has talked about how he wants to show both sides of war, that the war is awful and horrible, and that the war is hell motif, but he also wants to show the war is really not glorious, but it was inspirational, and there are things about it. And I was rereading a summary from the Barristan 2 chapter from The Winds of Winter, and the very end of the chapter is this really exhilarating passage where Barristan sees the Ironborn attacking the Yunkai at the end of the chapter, and he says, it's like Baelor breaks spear and Maekar, the hammer and the anvil, we have them, and you can feel the exhilaration just kind of like pumping through that. He does undercut both sides of it. He undercuts like the war is hell notion because he sees that it is like horrific, and you have the broken man speech, you have the aspects of war, like you see Arya's chapters in Harrenhal where she sees like all of these captives being brought because as a result of the war to Harrenhal and being forced to slave labor by Tywin Lannister. But you also have things like Wyman Manderley's speech where he talks about the North remembers. And I think that, Michael, you and I have talked in the past about how that's basically George's love letter to just war theory, because the North has a reason to want to fight back against the Boltons, against an unjust regime. Like, it's like the series is not about like you should just take injustice lying down. It's also that you have to resist injustice, and sometimes violence is one of the methods that you use to resist injustice.
Right, exactly. I mean, going back to that Brienne chapter, kills the heck out of Rorge because he's about to murder some orphans. Like, if that's an appropriate time to be violent, is when someone's about to murder orphans. George wants to present both sides of war and violence in the story. Not just that it's hellish necessarily, but also that sometimes it's necessary and hellish, that it can be both at the same time. As Jojen Reed might say, if fire and ice can mate. What is it?
If ice can burn, then love and hate can mate.
That's the one.
Or something like that. Yeah.
Boom.
Which is totally inspired by, gonna bring this up just because it happens to be one of the comments in this thing, totally inspired by Robert Frost's poem Fire and Ice. which George has said is one of the reasons he named the series what it is. Carry on, carry on.
You can also see this in the mythology that he's looked back on. The War for the Dawn must have been horrific. Probably something like 90-95% of all people died. They still had to fight it because it was going to be the end of their species. There are such things worth fighting for. And you can see it all throughout the mythology and through most of the cultures that we see.
Maybe we could even zoom it out a little further and say that one of the big themes of the series is just presenting all angles, giving all perspectives on something. I think that was something that the top comment sort of touched on from El Dempsey 7.
The greater meta perspective is that George grew up as in the 50s. I mean, he was born in 1948, grew up in the 50s believing that America was always right in its wars. And then Vietnam comes around and he sees a war that he doesn't believe is justified. And he sees the fantasy and the fiction elements start to look at war as just being totally bad and there's being nothing appealing about it whatsoever. The problem is that George also is a student of history too, and he's looking back at folks like Thucydides and other people like that, which talk about like stirrings of the soul and like the comradeship that comes into like an army, and that has an impact on George. And so he says he has to write about both perspectives of showing both the hippie side and the realistic, and the side also that shows war to be kind of this exhilarating thing. And I think it's really good, and it's one of the things that appealed to me about A Song of Ice and Fire, because I came into this series shortly after a deployment to Afghanistan, and when I read it for the first time, I was like, man, George must have been in the army or something like that back in the day. Come to find out that he was a Vietnam War protester and had served in the Teach for America, right? He was in Teach for America, not the Peace Corps. But it was good enough fiction and good enough writing that it spoke to me and to some of my experiences coming out of a real war. And that was something that was really great about the series and what pulled me in to how George wrote it.
That's also something that was said about, who's the guy who wrote The Red Badge of Courage? Stephen Crane? Was that it?
Yep.
He wrote this book about a soldier story during the American Civil War, and a bunch of veterans and people in general picked it up, and they were astonished to learn that this guy hadn't even been in the military. So it really speaks to George's writing if he can be in that same class to you.
Yeah.
Speaking of the gods of A Song of Ice and Fire and how cruel they are, we have a post here from Tyrion T. Lannister 2 titled The Gods Are Not Good. In this excellent post, what he does is he takes every time George uses the words, if the gods are good, and shows that every time it's used, whatever they're saying is not going to happen. It's sort of like the Arbor Gold, where every time it's mentioned, there's lies usually. And he goes through it, and all these examples are great. Like the first one, it says, Robert pressed his fingertips against his temples. I am sick unto death of talk. On the morrow I'm going to the kings with the hunt. Whatever you have to say can wait till then. If the gods are good, I shall not be here on your return. You commanded me to return to Winterfell, remember? But Eddard was still there. It just goes down like this. The gods are always cruel in A Song of Ice and Fire. Their prayers are never answered. What do you guys think?
It's very much like the Arbor Gold. Whenever someone's drinking Arbor Gold, they're telling lies sort of thing, where now that you know that if someone's drinking Arbor Gold, you should be at least doubtful of their honesty. In the same vein, if they're saying if the gods are good, X is supposed to happen, then X is probably not going to happen. And if they say X is not going to happen, then X probably will happen. It's an excellent catch. And I really like this post a lot. These posts I really kind of gel to, because the post is 80% quotes from the book and only like 20% interpretation. Mm-hmm. And that's really good. And that's different because a lot of people want to put their own spin, to include myself, and their own editorial bent on what they're interpreting out of George's work. And this guy just says, if the gods are good, that didn't happen. If the gods are good, if only. If the gods are good, another one of Cersei's plans turns to dust. Like, that is a really good way of framing a post, and kudos to Tyrion T. Lannister too for writing it.
Kind of makes me wonder how many other of these kind of things Novi's picked up on, like Arbor Gold and gods are good. What other phrases is he using? I mean, obviously we don't know, but it'd be interesting to go back and look.
On a breastplate.
Maybe.
No.
Oh no, that constant theme.
I don't know. What if every time Jon flexes his hand, like in the next chapter, a minor character dies? or something like that. You know, like
Whoa.
some really esoteric connection George R. R. Martin came up with. Maybe that's why The Winds of Winter is taking so long.
It's all these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all these.
He's making up little
but
tricks
John
for everything.
flexes his sword hand, and I need to kill somebody.
Do you think John is gonna start flexing his paw?
Yeah, Ghost is gonna start like flexing his paw, and that's how we'll know it's John.
He's also going to be very brooding and be upset with Bowen Marsh.
Why don't they understand?
Ghost's hair is gonna grow out really long over his face.
Go to Hot Topic.
User something Zo something, which I guess is a Giscari name.
Sounds legit.
Something Zo something. And it was a Cersei parallelism that they noticed. Cersei and Robert both idolized and idealized these romantic figures from their youth. For Cersei, it was Rhaegar, and for Robert, it was Lyanna. Cersei, all through Feast, is comparing Aurane Waters to Rhaegar, and she was supposed to marry Rhaegar according to her father. Obviously, Robert has this very troubled story with Lyanna. So it's just interesting that these two people who, one of them wanted to marry Rhaegar, one of them wanted to marry Lyanna, neither of them got Rhaegar or Lyanna and ended up with each other. I guess that's a framework of looking at those two that I had not thought of before.
I really love this because I've seen a lot of other posts that talk about how Cersei becomes more like Robert. She's become much more promiscuous as Robert was, as well as is drinking a lot, same as Robert, and is like going into that alcoholism. And I just thought this was really great to see how the whole time they both kind of pined for each other's...
The one who got away, right?
Yeah, the one who got away. I also found a quote, and it's kind of funny because it seems that as though perhaps both Cersei and Robert were both imagining the other at the same time as the one who got away. In Cersei 7, Cersei goes, "The wrong man came back from the Trident. The queen would sometimes think as he was plowing her. In the first few years when Robert mounted her more often, she'd close her eyes and pretend that he was Rhaegar. And we already know from Cersei talking to Ned before that Robert had accidentally whispered Lyanna's name instead. So it's pretty weird."
It was on their wedding night too, so it made it all the worse, like their first night together.
Ooh.
The parallel too, like, exists too because, Cersei's putting on weight as she's drinking more.
Right.
And she was said to be the most beautiful woman in all of Westeros. And Robert was, as Ned put it, muscled like a maiden's fantasy back when he was leading his rebellion. So you have the most beautiful woman in the world and arguably the most handsome man in Westeros that end up together. And that parallel exists for them, that they're both kind of going in similar directions. And I really think this is a great post because it adds another feature to it. People have pointed out in the past that Cersei is beginning to resemble Robert more. That's something that I've read previously.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in their love lives is a wrinkle of this that when I look at it now, I think that George was very intentional with how he drew it out in Cersei's arc in A Feast for Crows and into A Dance with Dragons, and it's great. And I think it's a really cool thing because some of these catches, I look at them and I'm like, well, as a writer, maybe it just kind of comes unconsciously.
Right.
Maybe it's something that people overinterpret from the text, but I look at this and I'm like, this makes a whole lot of sense in the context of what George is writing with regard to Cersei becoming more like Robert. And I think it's great.
Absolutely.
I thought of another interesting parallel between them. While Cersei is fantasizing about Rhaegar, her first love was obviously Jaime.
Mm-hmm.
And we hear from Robert that before Lyanna, he actually, there was a girl in the Vale that he had Maya Stone with. Oh, yeah. And we hear from, I think it was from Ned, that Robert really loved Maya. And even before these fictionalized versions of people in their head, they both had other people they are interested in too. Like, the connections just keep going.
Yeah. And they both only had bastards.
That's true. That's a great one.
Ouch.
Whoa.
You think about it, Robert dies in a Game of Thrones, and Cersei has the whole that Ileana will love this, the Valonqar prophecy that is predicting her death after her children.
But that wasn't imminent.
It's imminent just in terms of like even the
not their whole marriage though.
Maybe. But at the same time...
Well, maybe for Robert he felt that way.
Yeah, maybe.
He felt what way?
That he's about to be killed or usurped at all times.
And they did give him that line in the show where he says, like, there's a war coming, Ned.
I don't know who it is.
There's a war coming, Ned. I don't know when. I don't know who will be fighting, but it's
Is it
coming.
Aaron?
For little to no reason.
And he somewhat feels that way. That's the whole reason why he crosses that line and gives the okay to try and kill Daenerys and Viserys is gone by this point, right?
He doesn't know he's gone.
Yeah.
So he sends the poisoner after both of them.
Like Cersei, he feels that same sort of maybe paranoia about the Targaryens still existing and threatening his rule.
Daenerys is Robert's Tyrion.
Yeah, and well, maybe Viserys for most of the time. He probably thinks Viserys as opposed to Daenerys. But
That's very true.
then, yeah, and I guess both Cersei and Robert are okay with killing children, so there's that too.
Hey, they're a match made in heaven.
Yeah,
They really
were
are,
made. Yeah.
though.
I mean, and I think that's what's so fun about this part of ASOIAF. You could take out all of the fictional kingdoms and the dragons and everything, and it would still be a story about these two people who they had their high school sweethearts who ended up not being with for various reasons and ended up with each other and were very sad. Those people exist in real life. It's not a fantastic situation.
There's a great Bruce Springsteen song about that.
Oh,
Please
gosh.
sing it. Sing it for us.
I don't think there's any great Bruce Springsteen songs. Hot take.
You get off this podcast. Get out of
Correct.
here.
Whoa.
Correct.
Whoa.
So, Aaron, you want to jump in? We're done with Michael.
Because we don't have a host anymore.
We have a husk.
So my favorite post this month is by A Song of Ice and Fire luminary. I guess we can call him that now, given that he essentially revolutionized how people look at particularly Dance with Dragons and Daenerys, Tyrion's, and Jon's arc, which people had dismissed previously, and now they're looking at it a lot more favorably as a result. This would be Adam Feldman, also known as Feldman10 from Reddit. He wrote a post. He came back. We hadn't seen him in a long time, and he has a theory about the Winds of Winter prologue, which is the Silent Man. Now, if you guys kind of remember in the 2014 timeframe, George goes to Comic-Con, and he says, you know, here's this little tidbit of a hint. Jane Westerling is going to be in the prologue, but she's not necessarily going to be the point of view character, which a lot of people took to be like, okay, Jane's going to be in it, but she's not going to be a prologue character. But this does provide a lot of information about what the prologue is going to be about, or rather where it's going to be set. We think it's going to be set in the Riverlands or maybe in the Westerlands. And so the discussion came about, who's going to be the point of view character? It's a great kind of discussion because you have a whole lot of minor characters that you're like, maybe he can be, maybe we'll have a Maester again, since we haven't had a Maester since A Feast for Crows. You know, if George is keeping with this Maester, Night's Watchman sort of paradigm, which is not necessarily, it's a pattern until it stops becoming a pattern.
Yeah.
I think I came to the conclusion that it would be this knight named Sir Foley Prester, who is leading the party back from River Run to Casterly Rock. But then Feldman came along, and before Feldman, it was our friend and editor, AdmiralKird, who has this idea that it's going to be, the prologue point of view character is going to be not Sir Foley Prester, not a Maester, but Sir Ilan Payne, which is great. And it's something that now I really, really want the point of view character to be Sir Ilan Payne. Feldman approaches it from a literary perspective, and what he's looking at it, and he sees that Ilan Payne would be a great point of view character because he would have a perspective on things like Aerys Targaryen, Tywin Lannister, Robert's Rebellion. But he's very different in that he can't speak, so it's going to be things that he listens, he hears, and his interpretations of it, and him living entirely inside of his head. But then he throws in some other really cool stuff too, from Arya's A Dance with Dragons chapters, where Arya's reciting the names, and one of the names that comes up is Sir Ilan Payne. What will happen is that Ilan will be the point of view character, it will be in the middle of the night, the snow will be falling down, because we know at the end of A Feast for Crows that the snow is falling in the Riverlands.
Because it's Christmas.
And because it's Christmas in Westeros. It's 12 days of Christmas. in
12 Days
Westeros.
of Westeros.
12 Days of Westeros. So,
Just FYI, that reference is about a Twitter campaign that George's minions held several winters ago that counted down to the last day of winter, and a lot of people thought that that was going to be the release date for The Winds of Winter, but it turns out that wasn't true, and George got quite a bit of heat for it. It was just supposed to be something fun.
Yeah. Jon Snow was pretty heartbroken.
we were all pretty heartbroken,
Yeah.
but we all got over it, I guess. So the post concludes with this idea that there will be an ambush by the Brotherhood without banners of the Westermen returning back to Casterly Rock. And then, Ilan Payne's there doing his thing, killing people and having a great time of it. But then Nymeria and her wolf pack appear and kill everyone that's in both Brotherhood without banners as well as the Westermen returning back to Casterly Rock. I think that's a really, really cool way of approaching it.
The imagery writes itself, the wolves descending out of the darkness, eating the people indiscriminately as the snow falls.
I left a comment saying, like, oh, it'd be great because it would show, like, that, the magical beasts are all bad sort of thing. And Feldman said, here I was actually thinking of the direwolves as metaphorical analog to the others. While the humans fight each other, the inhuman force will swoop in and destroy them. Seemed like a fitting thematic start to a book called The Winds of Winter to me.
And regarding the wolf pack, there is that thing that George said once. It was like, don't hang a wolf pack on the wall, referencing the idea of Chekhov's gun. The rule being that if you show a gun in the first act, it must go off by the third.
Right.
So, but I guess here he means a wolf pack.
Yeah.
Well, right, and you also have like things in A Dance with Dragons where Arya is warging Nymeria, and she's seeing Nymeria attacking sheep and cattle, but also attacking humans too, and killing humans and eating them.
Hey.
So there's a really interesting thing there where George seems to be setting the foundation for something that looks to be kicking off in The Winds of Winter.
Yeah, Jeff and I had this conversation about Ilan Payne being the prologue character, over a year ago?
It's like 2 years ago, yeah, almost, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. It was a long time ago. And I didn't actually come up with the idea. It was on Reddit, and it was a fairly well-read topic by user Long Island. He posted pretty much the same ideas that Feldman had in his topic, and as soon as I saw all the different intricacies that you could do with Ilan Payne, I was like, I'm sold. And so you and I, Jeff, were debating Jaime's Last Feast chapter, and we got to talking about there's one thing that George wrote into that chapter where Jaime is sending Jane Westerling away, and Jaime first doubles the group because it's not enough guards, and then he comes back later and he says again, double that. And so there are now 400 guards going with her instead of like the original 100. And I was thinking, like, why in the world is George writing this in there? And then after a while, I kind of got to think that that's going to come into play later, and that's going to be what's going to be the group's undoing. And you can imagine a scenario where that's going to really help them fight off the Brotherhood without banners, because now they have 400 people. But the problem with that is if you're taking guerrilla attacks on an open road for a long period of time, you're not going to be totally unscathed. And while you're moving, you're essentially becoming a giant dripping blood bag. And as soldiers fall, you have more bodies and more blood laying along the road that could really be picked up by, say, a giant wolf pack that is hanging out nearby.
Oh, that's a great point. That's a freaking great point.
That's a good one. Lead him right to him.
It doesn't seem to stand out at first glance, but I really think that could feed into it.
Feed into it, yeah.
Oh. Got him.
Oh.
We were talking about Varamir Sixskins earlier being a prologue character and setting things up for what we believe to be Jon warging into the Ghost at the end of A Dance with Dragons. When we get to Ilan Payne, that really kind of sets it up for a character losing their tongue, say, to a guy who's rampaging around the world, ripping people's tongues out, a.k.a. Quiet Lion.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's something actually our fellow moderator, John Hamfast42, talked about in one of the comments. He says, hey, this is great because now this gives a great segue for my theory that Tyrion will end up losing his tongue at some point in The Winds of Winter or in A Dream of Spring. It's great. And the thing is, like, prologues in George's universe don't just set up one theme. They oftentimes set up multiple themes, right? So the Winds of Winter having this inhuman force of wolves attacking, symbolizing the others attacking human beings while they're fighting each other is great. But there's also could be back-ending some stuff about Tyrion losing his tongue. It could be talking a little bit about, the numbers of soldiers and the impact that warging has on the human and what warging has on the wolf as well. And that's actually kind of a great idea for a post, is to look at Arya as she's warging Nymeria and seeing whether there's been some sort of correlation between changes in her personality or her psychology as she's progressed. And because she seems to have a very, very strong connection with her wolf that is eating human beings.
I was reading this post and I was wondering about something where they say that Jane Westerling's going to show up. If this is Ilan Payne's thing and the wolves are going to attack, what happens when Nymeria and her pack get to Jane? Are they going to recognize her somehow? Some people wonder if she's pregnant.
In Jaime's Last Feast chapter, he gives specific instructions to Sir Foley Prester, which he says, if it looks like that Jane is going to be getting away, is going to escape from the group, I've placed archers nearby her so that they kill her. So basically, if the Brotherhood is attacking and they seem to be gaining some sort of advantage in getting close to Jane and to Edmure, if Edmure makes it down in time, which I really, really hope he doesn't, if this theory pans out, because he's like the last Tully, right? Essentially.
Blackfish is still alive.
Well, he's not going to get married though. There's like,
you never know. There's still time.
What you got against Edmure?
Yeah, what do you have against Edmure? So Jaime's plan is kill Jane. If things are getting hairy, kill Jane Westerling. Have the archers kill her. So I don't see.
And what's hairier than a pack of wolves?
Oh my god! Like, are we going to see wolves jumping in front of arrows, like protecting Jane?
Get down, Mr. President. Except it's
exactly.
Jane. It doesn't rhyme with happiness.
No, it doesn't.
Jane. It rhymes with wolves.
Close.
Those are our subreddit highlights for this month. I believe you have an urgent commitment that's going to take you away from us, BryndenBfish, for a short period of time.
Yes, I have to. I have to go do one of my hour-long squats.
It's been a real treat.
It has been. I'll see you guys back at the talk about the 5-year gap.
Bye, Jeff. I love you.
And now it's time to enter the Thunderdome. 4 or 5 bad opinions enter. One opinion might leave. What will it be? What's it gonna be about?
Oh my god.
I don't know. We'll find out.
This month we'll be covering the recent news about the Game of Thrones spin-off prequel series. It's been confirmed there are at least 4 writers working on 4 different stories, maybe 5 if you believe George. And we'll be presenting our own ideas on what they all should be. And joining us this week will be Sam R.
Hello, folks.
Ah, it's Sam!
From the land down under, it's Sam R.
And that's all you all need to know about Sam R, folks.
Australian.
I'm Samuel, or yes, on Reddit, I'm very efficiently known as -Sam-R-. I do the music for these podcasts, and yeah, I've been a Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire fan since around 2007, so I came to stuff a bit earlier than the show and all that.
Sam's also special because he reads George's other stories as well.
Wow.
I don't know how you do that to yourself.
Well, that's true, yeah. Wild cards and all that.
Yeah, I draw the line at wildcards, but I've read most of his other published
Sam,
stuff.
what are your thoughts on Avalon?
Ooh.
I think A Song of Ice and Fire is just one huge distraction from the science fiction book George has been working on since the early 90s, and he really should be getting around to. But as soon as he resolves the Westerosi knot, he's getting right back to it, and it's going to come out quick as it can.
The Westeros.
Well, there you have it, folks. Sam is an optimist.
Is that your desire for a Game of Thrones sort of spin-off series? Is actually Avalon developed as a TV script?
I hadn't thought of that because my hopes have been so quashed, but if George could funnel the money towards an Avalon show instead, I'd be stoked, yeah. Why not? People
Best
would love
of
it.
both worlds. Yeah.
I'm sure he has room to take on an additional project.
I'm curious, though, about what everyone's thoughts are on the spin-off, because George has already shot 2 big ones down, which is relatively breaking news as of recording this. he's already said that Dunk and Egg and Robert's Rebellion aren't on the table, which I know some of us were really hoping for.
How could he do that to Dunk? Dunk's a wonderful character.
The weird thing is a couple years ago he said, the quote was something like, Dunk and Egg is the natural progression for any sort of Game of Thrones spinoff.
Yeah.
He's just kind of doubled back on that and said, like, this was written by Joanna Robinson in Vanity Fair in April of last year. And George said, the most natural follow-up would be an adaptation of my Dunk and Egg stories. Each of the novellas could easily be done as a 2-hour standalone movie for television. That would probably be the ideal way to do them rather than as an ongoing weekly series. The Hedge Knight and its sequels are lighter in tone than A Song of Ice and Fire, more in the realm of action-adventure.
I feel like the Summer Hall finale would not be light in tone, but certainly the rest of them.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, how do you wrap that up?
What do you mean? There's like fireworks, it's green fire.
I think George agrees with the idea that Dunk and Egg is natural progression for maybe not a Game of Thrones spinoff, but like A Song of Ice and Fire spinoff. And he kind of wants to save all of that glory and the greatness of Dunk and Egg for himself and the Song of Ice and Fire series.
Yeah, I think that could
The
be
Mystery
true.
Knight only started getting a comic adaptation like this year, and that's been out for like 6 or 7 years now, so he's definitely not always been on a rush for the adaptions of Dunk and Egg to come through.
It's true. He's also got a whole bunch planned. Hasn't he said he's like 7 more stories planned for it?
Loads and loads.
Yeah.
So, Eliana, why don't you lead us off? What's your pitch for the Thunderdome of ideas?
So one of the writers that we saw is working with George R. R. Martin is Carly Rae, who's worked on Mad Men and The Leftovers, and she's working on the second season of Westworld, potentially called Samurai World, depending on how you feel. I'm down with Samurai World. I love Samurai Jack. I love Into the Badlands. Everyone check it out. And Carly Rae has a great track record for making these episodes that really focus on some of the issues that women are facing in their world and their society. So I am pitching the adaptation of a more in-depth look, as opposed to a written version by Maesters, of The Princess and the Queen.
Whoa. One of the better novellas. It's right up there with The Road Prince.
Are you being sarcastic?
I mean, those are like the two on the list, right? I mean,
obviously we all know that the Dunk and Egg novellas are like great because of their depth and how much we get to know Dunk and Egg, but those are off the table, so that leaves really only 2 to compete with one another. So when you say one's the better novella, the bar is low.
yes.
Not The World of Ice and Fire, just as a TV show?
It's not a novella, it's like an entire like encyclopedia and compendium.
Or The Book of Maps? That'd be a good one.
But how would this work? Because Princess and the Queen in the Dangerous Women anthology is just a straight up like historical narrative. I mean, it's got some spice, but it's
all the spice
unlike
you
Elaine
need.
Stone. It is not all this. Damn it! You beat me to it.
I'm sorry, Elaine.
But no, so really, how does this work as good television if it's not just George R. R. Martin sitting and reading his narrative into the camera for 2 hours a week?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that George wants to explore, of course, as he always says, he harkens back to this idea of Faulkner and the human heart in conflict with itself, and the difficulty that we have with the current version we have of The Princess and the Queen is that it's told from the perspective of a maester, right? It's given to us in some ways kind of coldly and just point blank of, these are the facts, these are what happened, and we get some editorialization, some sensational aspects, but we don't really know, like, how the characters feel and how they conflict with themselves and the difficulties that they face. Like how, for example, would Rhaenyra have felt knowing that her father promised her the crown, and then suddenly seeing this brother and someone who should have been a mother to her steal that away from her?
Right.
And I think in The Princess and the Queen, we get a lot of potential to go in depth with this idea of a political realm where women, Alicent and Rhaenyra, are facing one another for power over Westeros, as opposed to the version we have now where we have women trying to gain power in Westeros. We have these women trying to retain power in Westeros.
Right.
And we get to see sort of like how it works as women's rights and their ability to be rulers begins to erode, and what that means for them on a personal level as well as on the societal level.
Dang.
Hard to argue with that.
Whew.
Wouldn't a more humanized, close look at the characters like this undercut the very sterile Wikipedia-style nature of the Princess and the Queen? Isn't that its greatest plus?
So mean.
Well, that's the beauty of it, right?
Well, something just comes to mind, though, is if they adapted the Dance of the Dragons, you'd assume, because it's a TV show, they'd want the big, heavy effects stuff towards the event episodes near the end of the season, right? So they'd want to.
Yeah, I was about to say this.
They'd want to shift around the.
I do assume
They'd want to
that.
shift around the history, but the big problem with that is, as we know from the absolutely huge outcry over Jay Harry's The Second getting cut, fans will not stand for minor, vague historical details getting slightly changed for the purpose of storytelling.
I'm still not over Jaehaerys the Second.
Maybe he'll be a dragon instead.
There is just non-stop dragons in the story. Everything is like something having to do with a dragon. The CGI budget would just be out of control for this thing.
That's true. That's true. It would probably a higher budget per episode than Game of Thrones, right? Like maybe fewer episodes total, but you've got to assume there's going to be a big budget. All the battles, too. I mean, it's a war.
Yeah.
And it's a big question of HBO because as far as financially projecting the next series, if they do something like that, they're going to have to maintain nearly the same viewership of Game of Thrones to keep that budget. And we don't exactly know what the viewership is going to be like in a year, and we don't know what the retention is by the time that series would actually hit air.
Would the lack of the returning cast be a plus in that they don't have to pay those bloated like wages that get high every year to them anymore, or would it be bad because people aren't tuning in because of Jaime and Cersei and all their actors anymore?
Right.
It's a good question, because they started off with basically nobody, and now all those people are giant stars.
I know, I'm trying to think of a role in the dance that would be like important, but not necessarily someone you need to pay like a main cast character, you know, like Kristen Cole.
Kristen Cole.
There we go. Yeah, exactly.
Drift compatible.
Yeah, oh, perfect. Yeah. No, but so you cast like a big actor as Kristen Cole, and then he's in a few episodes and can bring people in.
Mm-hmm.
The main cast would be relatively new actors.
I think there's a way you could do it, though. A lot of the action of the Princess and the Queen doesn't really happen for a little bit, so maybe you could ramp up to it. But at that point, you're already sinking production costs because you're gonna have to put in the dragons. There are non-stop dragons.
Yeah.
You can't go through the wiki like more than 2 sentences before they mention a dragon doing something.
Yeah.
They have to be there.
They could also lower the budget and just have some of the fighting be between horses. People riding on horses instead, just
but like
for a
horses
certain part.
with big paper mache wings attached to them.
I have a question.
Oh, okay, Ileana.
Or an assertion. Both a question and assertion. Do you think that a lot of the popularity of Game of Thrones comes from the dragons? Because a lot of people tuned into Game of Thrones in the first place when we didn't have these giant dragon sequences. They tuned in for that political drama.
True.
They tuned in for seeing this conflict between all these different families, and that's what it was, especially during, I would assert, was the peak of when they acquired the most viewers, which was around season 3 and season 4, around these bigger twists that came from the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters, culminating with, of course, the Red Wedding at the Freys twins. So the dragons aren't, yes, the dragons are an integral part, of course, to a war called the Dance of the Dragons, but they're not the draw.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point.
I think Dani said it best in season 2 when she said, "Where are my dragons?" All these early seasons, people were clamoring for the big dragons to come through. So I don't know if I'd buy that. Where are my dragons, people?
TV is in a fairly different place than it was in 2011 when Game of Thrones started. I would say it's fair to say there's more good dramas on TV now than there might have been in 2011. Not that there weren't good dramas on TV, obviously.
Agreed.
There's a lot of Game of Thrones clones, too.
Yeah.
But, prestige TV and all that kind of stuff. Maybe a Game of Thrones show that's purely politics would get lost in the mix, and it needs the fantasy element, the dragons, to sort of set itself apart from any other prestige drama. Otherwise, it's just costumes and they have swords.
Even
It's
that,
true.
there's so many fantasy adaptations that are going to come down the line.
True.
Like,
That's true.
the Wheel of Time show is going to be happening. American Gods is happening. So it's going to be harder to differentiate.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
They're doing King
Killer, right?
Yeah.
A thought that very naturally raises to my mind just now is that so much of the success of these big shows, whether Game of Thrones or the other event shows that have always been around, is just the cultural momentum, in that if your friends are watching something, you feel like watching it because it's the in thing. You want to talk at the water cooler. You want to talk with your friends. And it's, it makes me wonder sometimes, even like if you take all the context out of these shows, people might still love them. Like it might be a validating thing, or they might not. It might be much more a social thing. But in any case, so much of this is just carryover, whether for the spin-offs or another show doing this. It's just carryover from the idea of if it's big, it's going to get bigger because people are watching it. But without the main Thrones cast, I don't know how much they'll sustain that.
Yeah, if something else comes over and grabs that viewership of like the event TV of the week, will the competition take it over and take that group, because people only have so much to watch on Sundays.
Yeah.
And if Game of Thrones is going up right up against another one of these shows and everybody's like, you got to watch this at the water cooler.
I'll be honest, with Twin Peaks coming this summer, I don't know how I'm going to balance my Sunday nights, because I kind of would rather watch the new Twin Peaks than Game of Thrones. I mean,
well, you've got two peaks to balance things on.
Speaking of American Gods, my proposal for the prequel of Game of Thrones would be the Age of Heroes done in the style of American Gods, where we look back at a lot of the stuff that's in the World of Ice and Fire, the mythology, all the amazing people like Lan the Clever, Garth Greenhand, Brandon of the Bloody Blade. Because if you look back at all these stories, what a lot of them have in common is they're all the political stuff that we love from the current Game of Thrones stuff. The stories are no different. It's just always the context and where these people are coming from. And it's all inter-house fighting. Like the story of Garth the Greenhand and all his children is basically the Lannisters of today. How they're all fighting for their father's throne. How they're all trying to make their own way despite being in this crazy old society. And we get the advantage of we get to see like a lot more of the Children of the Forest, because this would be when they were most powerful. The Valyrians would still be doing their thing around these times.
You mean they'd be like sheeping?
Yeah.
Yes, they would be sheeping on the 14 flames before they find the dragons. And I think kind of like American Gods, you can make interesting stories out of characters that people already know and connect with a little, like what's his name? Is it Durandon?
Yes.
Duran.
God's Grief.
Duran's
God's Grief. The guy who made Duran God's
So much
Grief.
thing out there, Flair.
Oh my god. Duran God's Grief. And all this stuff with Bran the Builder and how the wall was created, all this great backstory that people spend tons of time theorizing about, and it'd be really interesting to try and give it a historical way of looking at it instead of the crazy mythical way we get and the legends that we get from the Citadel.
So I gotta say, I was kind of on the fence, but you mentioned the wall, and I feel like that could be such a good marketing tie for them. Like, this is how it began. This is how the wall was raised. That kind of thing.
You could do War for the Dawn if you wanted.
That's true, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of potential there for like a high fantasy series, sure. Game of Thrones, the television show, doesn't make a big deal as much about some of these historical characters. Like, I don't think they've ever mentioned Lan the Clever or Duran God's Grief or Garth Greenhand.
Duran God's Grief, who gets along with the hungry like the young wolf.
Exactly. He loves Brandon.
Right.
I see what you mean. But I think you could sell it really easily by saying, like, this is where the Starks started. This is where, like, the Lannisters got their start. Just, like, pitching all these houses that people are already very attached to. It's like, see where they came from. See how this all came about and how it's still the same story, but in a much more high fantasy setting than it is now.
Would you call it Game of Thrones Origins?
Oh! No, he'd call it Game of Thrones First Class.
Speaking of First Class, the writer of X-Men First Class is actually one of the people who is developing the new series, Jane Goldman, which I wrote this post a couple of days ago, and George already shot down Duncan Egg as one of the potentials. But I was going off information where he himself said that this would be a natural follow-up, so I can't really blame myself.
How can you rely on him?
Jane Goldman writes a lot of fantasy stories. She wrote those 2 X-Men movies, she didn't do Apocalypse, but she also did Stardust, which I really loved. She did the Kick-Ass movies.
Those are
well.
Kick-Ass was good.
So,
which were enjoyable, but completely different from the message portrayed in the comics.
Hipster.
if she was looking to do a more fantasy-oriented story, doing that back in the Age of Heroes would kind of make sense because it's so far removed from the rest of the time period. And as we're going forward in A Song of Ice and Fire, not so much in Game of Thrones, but magic is creeping back into the world, where if you go back that far, you'd expect, you know, there to be crazy stuff going on, maybe.
Yeah.
So, and people also speculate, like, how could giants build the wall and stuff like that, and all this magic that it takes to build Storm's End. So, yeah, I could definitely see that that's a possibility. I'm not sure that that would... It's hard to take it from that genre and go straight into super high fantasy, such as that, and expect that maybe your viewers are going to tune in for something that's entirely different than what they experienced before.
It's got two things going for it, though. In the Age of Heroes, you don't have a lot of the big CGI budget that you do now. You can do the children pretty easily. You're not going to see a lot of dragons unless you believe Lucifer Lightbringer, and there's dragons everywhere during this time that nobody knows about. But you can just sort of cut that out if you feel like. Second thing it has going for it is a lot of the high fantasy we're going to see is... it will be like the way it is now, where it will be near the end. It's going to start off with politics and two races meeting each other. And like a father and his children and these people trying to like build their homes in this unknown land. Eventually we get to like the Hammer of Waters and the shattering of the Arm of Dorn. But that's later on. You could sell people the same way they did with Game of Thrones.
It sounds like something that's for a bunch of nerds.
Wait, that's us.
Whoa.
Aren't we nerds?
For yourself, dude.
What were you talking about with the comic version of Kick-Ass?
My perhaps unpopular idea for the Game of Thrones prequel spin-off would be to make a legit, all-out, full series Game of Thrones / Westworld crossover. Now,
That is pretty unpopular.
George himself floated the idea over dinner to the two lovely Westworld showrunners last year, which their response sounds like they took it as a compliment, but they turned it down. I don't know how serious the offer was in the first place, but I really hope it was very serious. But anyway, there's certainly a ton of reasons not to do it, and why it could be very unpopular with fans of either show or with people in general, like breaking viewers' senses of immersion, muddying and diminishing the relative brands, being really convoluted, being really meta, being an uncharacteristically like commercial move from HBO, mashing shows up together, all the havoc it'll play with the
What are you going to make the case for your show?
Why is this a good idea?
I think there's a lot of value to the idea that would play to the strengths of both of the shows. Because George has always, since the 90s, characterized A Song of Ice and Fire, and by extension Game of Thrones, as in part a response to the genre, and to Tolkien in particular. The big moments of the series, the big water cooler moments, are so often genre-defying ones, like the protagonist's death at the end of the first book, all the good guys getting slaughtered in the Red Wedding. It's this stuff that reacts against fantasy that people get really into, the meta sort of stuff that's reflecting on it in that way. These aren't like standalone fantasy works you could have someone read as their first... well, a lot of people do read them as their first fantasy, I suppose. But they're not in a vacuum. They're reflecting back off the genre.
Surely they've seen Star Wars.
Well, you'd hope. Westworld does the same thing kind of for Westerns and sci-fi, and in a more general sense, just consuming media that's power fantasies in the first place, with all its focus on if people enjoy this sort of power fantasy, what does it say about them? So they've both got this kind of meta outlook to them. And then a crossover could bring that kind of reactive to the genre nature of both the shows to the forefront by setting up Westeros World, which would be Westeros as a big theme park where all the Westerosi are robots, but they don't know that. And then humans like us come in and incognito and enjoy all the pleasures and pain that Westeros has to offer.
Wow.
And then the time period could be anything very bloody, anything chaotic and titillating. The Blackfire Rebellion, the dance, like Eliana said, the Andal invasion, anything with a lot of fighting and sex.
I think that's the entire history.
And then this Westeros World show could examine why these visitors would go to it in the first place. And then, on the other level, it's saying, why do we watch and read Westeros in the first place? Is it the sex, the violence, the grittiness? Is it something more noble and something else? Is it both?
Wow.
Is it neither? I feel like this would be a very logical thematic progression after Game of Thrones has ended and everyone's had time to reflect on it. So they can then look at, why did I enjoy this series?
Right.
What does it say about me? And then Westeros World could validate it or invalidate it or whatever it wanted to do. I just think it would play really interestingly together.
Wow. I got it.
Yeah, I think...
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm going to say what's on all of our minds, which is I didn't expect to agree with you that much, Sam. Like, I didn't expect to like that idea as much as I did. But you make a really good case about it following up naturally after the end of Game of Thrones, zooming out a little bit and saying, okay, so you liked this story, so let's take it back a step and, like, why do you like this story? Why do people like these kind of stories? That kind of thing.
Yeah, totally.
Because Sam really framed it in the way of the thematics.
Yeah.
I could see it happening like several years down the road in maybe like the 4th or 5th season of Westworld. And the Game of Thrones would be a couple of years post, and you could kind of bring some of these actors back into the series, and you could do some kind of fun things also with the plot that people already know, such as the characters get trapped in Westworld and they do something to overwrite the program, and you have the Red Wedding again, but this time the Starks end up winning it because the people have to try and undermine the androids in the program in order to survive or something, and it totally changes the dynamic of the story from like a twisty Westworld perspective that people enjoy.
So would this be a sort of thing where the people characters, not the Westerosi characters in the show, have seen Game of Thrones?
Ooh.
I would say it is like there being one person there who is the character who knows what it is and nobody else does.
Sure.
And they kind of like explain what's happening as it goes along. And they're like, this is going to happen. Like, we need to be worried about this and this and this.
Right. As you know, Tyrion and Jaime are brothers. Yeah, I gotcha.
Like one of us just shows up, one of us insanely rich, like 100 years in the future.
Now that's a show.
I was a Song of Ice and Fire mod.
That's a show I would watch.
This is actually my my primary problem with Westeros World, is it sounds like a huge amount of fan service without like a big story to tell. Like Westworld, for all the sex and the violence, it was telling a story about AIs and like free will and how this kind of violence can change you. What would Westeros World add to that story that's not already there, other than just including characters we know?
I think going back to what Aaron articulated about Sam's point, Westworld touches on themes explored in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think that Westworld works because A Song of Ice and Fire is kind of, in many ways, deconstructing our idea of the songs and stories that we all grew up with, all these fairy tales around which we build our lives, and which we think that, yeah, I'm going to be fulfilled. I'm going to be the hero of my life. And Ford says in like episode 2, after the sprightly young scriptwriter comes up with this narrative of, this like bloodbath next to the river in which people experience death and prostitutes and all these like cheap thrills. And Ford says, what is the point of it? Get a couple of cheap thrills, some surprises, but it's not enough. And he says, it's not about the titillation, horror, elation, they're parlor tricks. The guests don't return for the obvious things we do, the garish things. They come back because of the subtleties, the details. They come back because they discover something they imagine no one had ever noticed before, something they've fallen in love with. They're not looking for a story that tells them who they are. They already know who they are. They're here because they want a glimpse of who they could be. And I think that a good story does that. And by melding the themes that A Song of Ice and Fire explores, especially in terms of identity and how it makes us uncomfortable with who we think we are based on the stories we've grown up with, it really meshes well with what Westworld wants to explore.
Wow.
One of the really neat things about Westworld is how it can show you an AI going through its cyclical arc over and over, and how some of that can be changed by the AI's nature, but you don't always have time to do that. You look at, say, the Man in Black's arc with Lawrence, and you really don't get a feel for what Lawrence is normally going through in that situation in his arc, because the Man in Black is just dragging him along on his own story, his own quest.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things Game of Thrones can provide is that it already is an established medium that the audience knows, so you don't have to go back and show them things already.
Mm-hmm.
Westworld is also a show that largely revolves around throwing the audience twists. And one thing that you can do with that is dealing with the audience's preconceived notions about what they believe Game of Thrones to be. So you can do things like go to the Red Wedding and not have it end up the way that it actually did in the show. And you can tie in things like, say, having human characters who are stuck in this world that you can more closely relate to because they're actually humans that live in our world. Well, a futurized version of our world. And so you can have them in this moment where they like fear for their life and they are actually searching for a peaceful way to resolve this situation. Yeah, right. And if you're a writer that's trying to do commentary on these sort of things with violence, it's really hard to create something that's as powerful as the Red Wedding is. So if you can use that, then your argument can become all the more effective.
Yeah, that's brilliant. You know, thinking of Talisa getting stabbed makes me realize the villains of Westeros world would have to be D&D.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah.
Which one's the Man in Black?
Oh, yeah, but actually, the villains would not just be D&D. They would be us. They would be us, the viewers.
I don't think it actually is about the viewer, because the British guy that Ford's talking to, he seems to be a surrogate for these other writers who develop these sort of situations, and they kind of lure people in with these crazy plots and stuff, but they kind of stay for these other things, and maybe these writers really don't know what they have. Ford says the viewer knows what they want when they come in. They know who they are. It's the writer that doesn't understand them.
That's fair.
But to sort of, I agree with all that, and those are all great points, but to go back to Westworld Season 1, a lot of it was Dolores and her waking up and how she interacted with the Man in Black. What would the Westeros plotline give us that's something like that if we merged them? It just seems like what you guys are saying is if we redid Westworld but added A Song of Ice and Fire on top of it as a skin, it would need its own story. What's there left to add if we're already 2 or 3 seasons into Westworld that Westeros world would add?
I think we'd have to ask John Nolan to find that out.
Yeah, probably.
That's a good point.
So I feel like the themes that Westworld is exploring is freedom, especially because it chooses its setting as like the Wild West, and freedom to be like who you are within the park, or the idea of the hosts being free to be who they are outside of it and outside of whatever their programming is. And I wonder if Westeros world, especially with its basis in The Song of Ice and Fire, like building off of all of these fairy tales and these various mythologies that we've grown up with, would be trying to examine how we free ourselves from these narratives that we grow up around of I'm the princess in the tower and someone's going to come save me, or I'm the knight and I'm going to save the princess in the tower. So maybe Westeros world could be something like that. I don't know.
That's interesting. Your point on the different settings, like the Western to the more fairy tale thing, makes me realize Westerns have like this implication because it's frontier, that it's unnatural and temporary. Like eventually the frontier will be conquered, eventually the chaos will be abated. But fantasy, especially A Song of Ice and Fire, which seems so static, is just kind of staying chaotic and staying bloodthirsty. It doesn't really feel like it's developing into, you know, a more tempered world. So I think that's something the show might have something to say on, is like, why do we enjoy fantasy being such a static setting in general?
Yeah. And I will say that especially fantasy worlds like Westeros are usually almost post-apocalyptic. Like all the great civilizations happened a long time ago. And so
it's a great point.
Just in terms of the setting, it's like a post-apocalypse with swords almost.
It's the setting and their mindset at that time, because for them, a lot of the great times happened before then, until you come across the Renaissance. They're like looking back at the Greeks or looking back at the Romans, and they're like, damn, these people built these like giant arches.
Yeah, how do you build an arch? I don't know. I guess we're idiots.
That's what would play with the science fiction so well, where sci-fi is so much about looking into the future instead of the past.
Right.
Yeah.
I also answered my own question while you guys were talking. You could have a thing where you could have like the central AI going rogue and have it take over like the Weirwoods or something like that, and have that be the underlying subplot that's going on beneath all this other great stuff you guys are talking about. Like, what's the science fiction fact thing that Westeros adds? It could be actually like the Weirwoods taking over, and it's actually just the computers.
That's a really good idea, especially because George has done stuff like AI that works really similar to the Weirwoods in some of his earlier stuff, like A Song for Leah. I really like that idea.
Now I'm on board. Now I like this.
We did it.
Going back to what Eliana said about the main theme of Westworld being about freedom and such, and the AI in that regard, George takes a lot of time to develop sort of the nature versus nurture psychology of giving you gray characters that you can relate to based upon their environments that you're in. And when I think about going back to, say, like Rob's decision, the Karstark stuff, everything about executing Karstark revolves around Rob being like trapped in his environment.
Yeah.
Like he has no way out possible. And so there's a way that you can do that where if you're an AI and Rob's being played by Richard Madden.
They probably couldn't get the same actors.
Well, in 5 years.
Yeah, maybe. You never know. Go ahead. Sorry.
Like, he would be an AI, and he would be, like, felt like both that he's trapped in his programming, but also inside the world that he's in, as far as, like, I have to make this kind of decision here. I can't make a more nuanced decision to go against and betray the lords underneath me, and blah, blah, blah. I have to actually execute this guy, and the other AIs and humans are in there, and they're like, no, you can't. You don't actually have to do that. You can search for a more political situation. We'll deal with these things when they come to it, and it's more about the freedom in both aspects that Game of Thrones and Westeros kind of challenge, and that's a moment where you could center those two things right there.
Yeah.
That's
great.
That's great. That idea of characters like being trapped makes me think, could Beric like be played as this host that keeps killing himself to try and get out of the cycle? But keeps getting resurrected, except consciously.
He is. Yeah. He's what's his name? He's the
like
Spaniard
Maeve.
that keeps getting resurrected.
Or that.
Yeah.
Or Maeve, yeah.
Wow. Well, mine is kind of an underdog coming into the arena, but I think it's going to win the hearts and minds of the American people.
He's Australian.
International community as well.
There you go.
My spin-off is entitled Song of the Sea Snake, The Adventures of Corlys Velaryon. And it is a Doctor Who style show about Corlys Velaryon traveling traveling the high seas of the world of ice and fire aboard his ship, the Sea Snake, and adventuring to different places. And I definitely have like a Doctor Who model in mind where there can be an overarching plot for the whole season and recurring characters, things like that. But the bulk of it will be these episodic adventures as Corlys visits 1,000 islands and gets some salad dressing, or goes to Ibn. Yeah. And I think it would be cool. I've been writing this whole fan fiction in my head, so George, please give me money.
George, please hire. Oh, we're gonna make a GoFundMe.
Yeah, okay,
George.
Perfect.
You would hire Michael.
GoFundMe Corlys Velaryon.
We don't really need money. We just need you to retweet Michael constantly.
Yeah. How many RTs to get this series made? But you could have this overarching story with the Rogue Prince himself, Daemon Targaryen. I know, he has got so many fans. Showing up as a recurring character throughout the series. Maybe getting his buddy Corlys out of some tight jams with his sweet dragon. You could culminate in an arc about the conquest of the Stepstones or something like that. As sort of a mini-series finale. I think the bulk of it would be these episodic adventures bopping around a fantasy world. And I think one bonus is that it opens up the casting a lot more, because they've really sort of established Westeros as a really white place. And it would be kind of nice to have his crew could be anybody, right? It doesn't have to be Westerosi sailors. They could be free to explore just about anything, given the nature of Corlys' voyages. And they could touch on fan favorite things. He sails north of the Wall at one point, interacting with these houses and stuff that we've seen in Game of Thrones. So I think it's a real winner on the fall TV schedule coming soon.
If it was really successful, they could totally mimic Doctor Who and have Corlys regenerate into a new character that could go on further adventures.
Jesus.
It's the sea snake that sheds its own skin and takes up the new
like
title.
An Ouroboros.
Oh, the Ouroboros.
Wait, what house is that? Never mind. Forget
House of Valerion, yeah.
I was thinking like Firefly of the open seas.
Oh, yeah.
That'd
See,
be
that's a good
awesome.
model, too. Yeah.
Oh, if it was like Firefly, you could have Jalabar Zoe be on the ship because he lost the war.
Whoa.
True.
Because Firefly is all made by like the people who had lost the Civil War and
they're
stuff.
the rebels.
Oh, that would be cool, actually, yeah. I mean, obviously, Jalabar Zoe is alive many years after Corlys Valerian, but you could have the equivalent of Jalabar. Maybe his ancestor, who's also named Jalabar Zoe.
Well, he's not in the TV show, so you could just transpose
That's
him
true.
in the past.
That, you know what? That's a good point. Yeah, it's canon. Mm-hmm.
It can be time travel anyway. If you're taking off Doctor Who, you can have Jalabar travel back in time.
Like he reaches the Bridge of Dreams on the Rhine and just goes back in time a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Hold on. It's not Doctor Who with a W. It's Dr. XO with a X at the beginning.
Oh my god.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, even if it's not my man Corlys Valerian, I think they could really hit it off with some sort of anthology show with a small central cast and then sort of exploring different things, different areas. That's more episodic maybe than Game of Thrones is. I mean...
Yeah.
I know George nixed it, but I thought a similar idea, but set after Game of Thrones, could work, and that it would have a lot of pull because it's directly after and could have some returning people, but it could just be like some person going around and checking out everywhere and the after effects and stuff.
Right.
But I think a prequel would work a lot better now that you framed it like that.
You could also have a multiple protagonist kind of thing. You jump time frames. Like you could have Lomas Longstrider in there. Have him go visit the stuff inland while Corlys is doing the stuff along the ocean. That would be really interesting. What are your top 5 locations you want to see him visit?
Okay, all right. This is an excellent question, and thank you for asking it, Matt.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is really good. High on the list for me is Gogossos, which is an island off the coast of Sathorios, south of Valyria. That was once a Valyrian colony where they practiced magic eugenics, basically, and tried to breed monsters and all this horrible stuff. So you could see a great sort of horror episode, or even a couple episodes set in the ruins of Gogossos, which is just a cool name in general. Other than that, I would say Ashai is an easy answer, right? I mean,
sure.
I'm not even sure if Corlys canonically made it to Ashai in the histories. Obviously Karth, because Karth is pretty dope, and it would be good to get a second shot at Karth after like the show had to do it on a low budget.
You could also see Karth when it was still great.
Yeah, right. Karth several hundred years ago.
Or close to it.
Well, it was the greatest city that ever was and ever will be.
Right, so it's always...
Yeah.
When it was slightly better.
You could make Karth great again and then have a lot of social commentary on the wall.
Corlys puts on his red hat.
Okay, so I think that's 3. North of the Wall. It would be so cool to have this voyage north of the Wall.
Like Cannibal Bay? Are we looking at that? Are you looking to go east?
Down by Cannibal Bay, where the people grow. Back to my home.
Not there.
I do not.
I was just gonna let that play out. I don't know. I would need to be looking at a map, I guess. But in the canon, he goes basically as far north as it's possible to go.
Okay.
That would be a good episode, at least. You could do a sort of whole Rime of the Ancient Mariner thing.
Mm-hmm. That'd be a good one. Everything freezes.
Yeah. And then the 5th one... Oh, the Summer Islands, of course.
Of course.
The Summer Islands.
Yep.
I was waiting for the Summer
with the
Isles.
temples of Poontang.
Yeah.
That's...
That would just be the sex episode.
Or it could be the not sex episode and subvert people's expectations about the Summer Islanders.
That would be really funny if, like, there's a crew member who's, like, building up the Summer Islands, who's like, oh, yeah, Corlys, we gotta go to the Summer Islands. It's where you're gonna get laid. But then they go there, and it's just like any other place. Like, it's not... Be like, I got laid more in King's Landing. And then, like, looks into the camera. Like, Jim on the... Okay, so it's like The Office.
So he's like Jim.
Oh my god, what if we had a Game of Thrones show like The Office?
The brothel. And it's just...
Cersei Small Council.
Yes.
Varys just pans the camera.
Yeah, right.
No.
Rain Waters, I think, would be the Jim in that situation. Looking into the camera.
Who'd be the Dwight?
Oh, no. It's Randall Tarley. He is constantly going like,
No,
can you believe
I
this
think
shit?
Randall is Dwight. I think Randall Tarley is Dwight Schrute.
Ooh. That's also a good pick.
Rugen is Creed.
That's perfect.
Just Varys
That'd be
with like a
amazing.
wig on, standing in front of Cersei, and he's like, "Well, I'm just gonna go back down to my jail cell."
Where I totally work.
Wait, who's Michael Scott then?
Guess it
Cersei.
would have to be Cersei,
Cersei.
yeah. So it's like season 1 Michael Scott.
Would Tyrion be Toby in that case?
Yeah.
Would he be Ryan?
No, because Michael loves Ryan. So Ryan would be Arianne
Yeah.
Waters because
Yeah.
Ooh.
young, attractive man who ends up succeeding. For all of those of you like Eliana who haven't seen The Office, we apologize. We
Things.
apologize for
Whatever.
the last
Checked out.
5 minutes or whatever. So I'm standing by Corlys Valerian. That's my final pitch. That's my
I
final
like
answer.
it. I like it. It's got a lot of variety.
I think it's time to put down our spears and shields and slings and call off the dogs of war. The Thunderdome has been a lively place today, with each of us pitching our own script for George R. R. Martin to produce. And I think the clear winner was, of course, SOTS:TAOCV, or Song of the Sea Snake, the Adventures of Corlys Valerian. We're going to say adios to our Australian friend Sam. And
Why would we say adios to Sam?
we're
Why
going
would
to
we say good day?
Good day. I don't know. I mean,
Good day, Sam.
Mate.
Sam, thank you for joining us.
Well, Sam, how about we say bye?
We say bye usually. Just BYE.
Sounded like good day to me.
Play us off, Sam.
Alright guys, and so for this month's rotating topic, we wanted to talk about something that George R. R. Martin has talked about in the past that was a potential future and a potential storyline we could have gotten. A Song of Ice and Fire with the 5-year gap. George has talked about the 5-year gap a lot in some of his interviews. In a question asking what is the 5-year gap, George explains, essentially, my plan, as I have announced in many previous interviews, was to have a 5-year gap between the end of the 3rd book and the beginning of the 4th, in which some of the younger characters would grow up somewhat, and I would come back after that 5-year hiatus, and I would pick up the action at that point.
Yeah, okay. So instead of doing
Yeah.
a 5-year gap in the plot, he did a 5-year gap between the books.
How dare you? How dare you?
Well, yeah, and that explains, in fact, part of the reason why there was a 5-year gap in actual book releases is because George started writing the book
Right.
in that plot having this 5-year gap. Then he found out it didn't work, so he did the 5-year scrap, and
Whoa.
we have what we have today. Yeah,
5-year crap.
nailed it.
Well, I don't know. What do you guys think? I'll just throw it out there. Do you guys think it was good that George abandoned the 5-year gap, or is this something that you're like, you know, I really wish that George had kept this time gap in mind? Because one of the things he's talked about is that he had this 5-year gap in mind because of how young Bran and Arya and Sansa were in comparison to where the ages that he wanted them to be at as the books headed towards the end game. So you guys think like
Yeah.
it was a good idea for George to abandon the gap, or are you okay with the fact that A Feast for Crows picks up 5 minutes after the end of A Storm of Swords?
I have a very nuanced, subtle take on
Whoa.
the 5-year gap.
Wow. Can't wait.
I think it was
Captain Maribald over here.
I think it was a really good idea on paper. Like, when he was outlining the series, and not that he outlined it very much, but thinking about it, conceptualizing it in a structure, I think the 5-year gap made a lot of sense to sort of end with this big act break of the Red Wedding and all that, and then pick up 5 years later as things have started rolling again. But with the way Storm of Swords is written, I don't see how he could have made a 5-year gap work for some of the storylines, the way they wrapped up in A Storm of Swords. I think if he was going to do the 5-year gap, he needed to write the other books differently.
Ileana and I were talking about at Ice and Fire Con, you know, when George originally started writing a Game of Thrones, he was writing with this idea that the first chapter would take place at one period of time, and the second chapter would take place several weeks later. The third chapter would be like a month or two later, and so on and so forth. George didn't originally have a 5-year gap in mind. The 5-year gap would be interspersed with the narrative itself. But it's something that George has talked about, is that he couldn't really accomplish that very well. I mean, if you think about the opening to A Game of Thrones, that opens with the prologue, and then you have the next chapter takes place at least several weeks after, because it takes a long time for Garrett to get down to Winterfell to be captured by Ned's guards to be beheaded. And then the next chapter after that even takes place a few weeks later when Robert arrives at Winterfell to name Ned Hand of the King. But then you have the Winterfell Feast, and you have 3 chapters essentially around the Winterfell Feast. You have Bran being pushed out the window. All of these chapters take place in the span of like a day or two, right? So it became increasingly more difficult for George to actually integrate that jump in time and make it seem seamless in the narrative itself.
George didn't originally have the 5-year gap planned, and that was his solution to the slowing down of time as he was writing it. We jump from Winterfell to middle of the road on the way to King's Landing, and then bam, we're in King's Landing. Fantastic. But you have it completely different when you're looking at Brienne's chapters.
Yeah.
We see her going to all these different places. We're like really getting into the nuts and bolts of that journey along with Tyrion. We follow him along all these journeys, and
it slows down, absolutely, getting into like a Clash of Kings and the Storm of Swords, where you have these Arya chapters. You could see an alternate universe in which George takes these events that happen in the Arya chapters, say, I'm just taking them as an example, and maybe splits them into like 3 chapters total, and sort of does like a highlights reel in each chapter that's more broad and general and covers a long period of time. But instead you have all this material. That happens in books 2 and 3, and then definitely in book 4, like you were saying with Brienne, Ileana.
It's interesting when you point it out in the context of Arya, because Arya is obviously one of those characters whose storyline would have greatly benefited from having a 5-year gap, and now we get sort of the training reel, but it seems like George really slows it down, the narrative and the writing, when it comes to these travelogues, but he doesn't for the Stark children. Arya's chapters, we only have 3 of them in Feast, and they're all like these big moments of magics.
Same for Bran too, right? Because he has 3 chapters in A Dance with Dragons, and it's very like boom, boom, boom. Yeah. We're reintroduced to Bran and Cold Hands, and Jojen, Nymeria, and Hodor. We're attacked by whites, and suddenly I'm in, a master's class in working and in Green Sea, right. And that's as much grief as George gets for writing these travelogue chapters in Feast Dance. He doesn't write a whole lot of really fluff chapters when it comes to Arya and Bran, and even Sansa too. Even though she's the worst Stark, she only has 3 chapters. I'm not even a Stark.
Jeff is the worst Stark. Their role sort of switches, or at least Arya does. I feel like I'm harping on Arya, but the Stark kids I think make up a lot of meat in books 2 and 3. But then you have like 3 chapters for Arya across the latest 2 books, or whatever the total is. I don't remember. Don't quote me on that.
I'm going to harp on Arya for a second, because when George decided not to do the 5-year gap, he did it largely because he had all these major plots with major momentum. Right. But at the same time, at the end of A Storm of Swords, he had wound all of his point of view characters down to almost a near standstill. And in facilitating the momentum for the larger plots, he added point of views like Cersei, and the books started to grow in larger length. But with regards to characters like Arya and older point of views, especially with Arya, he has struggled to get her moving again. Most of what she's doing, with the exception of helping out Sam, is largely contained within her own universe.
Yeah.
Arya's story has such large problems that it may have actually been better if she had just been killed off at the Red Wedding.
Wow. Ooh, harsh.
Wow.
And I think it's still a real question mark when she is actually going to get back involved in mattering and being relevant and intertwining with the main characters of the story.
That's the thing, though.
If we had a 5-year gap, we'd know.
We would, but here's the thing. So in Arya's Winds of Winter chapter, in the Mercy chapter, she starts to re-engage with Westeros when... not Giles Rosby.
Raph the Sweetling.
I'm trying to think of the guy who's the treasurer, master of coin.
Harry Swift. Harry Swift.
Right. That's the thing, though. In the Winds of Winter, that seems to be changing because you have Harris Swift coming to Braavos to beg the Iron Bank for a loan in order to restore the crown's finances and relieve some of the debt collection the Braavosi bankers are doing.
Yeah.
And George has said that he's written enough material for Arya in the Winds of Winter to be like its own novella. So you're thinking about like a Hedge Knight or Sworn Sword or the Mystery Knight length of material that George has written, and he said this back in 2012. I mean, we're talking 5 years ago. Lord knows what the amount of material that George has written.
Why are you doing this to us, Jeff?
For Arya's sense, I'm sorry, I'm the worst. But that's the thing, right? So you have these training montages coming in, and now we're at the point where George actually wants the story to be at for these characters like Bran and Arya and Sansa, where they're just about at the cusp of doing things. So I think we're going to see a lot more material for all those characters come the Winds of Winter.
But here's the thing for me, though. If George has written that much for Arya so far, it can't be that intertwined with the plot, because he hasn't written the rest of the stories for her to intertwine with. And with regards to Harry Swift in the Winds of Winter Mercy chapter, Arya has nothing to do with Harry Swift. She has everything to do with Raph the Sweetling. Yeah. And when I look at Raph, I can't think of anybody that Raph matters to. Cersei isn't going to care if some guard got killed in Bravos, and Harry's just hired him a week or so ago before he left for Bravos.
Yeah.
So if Raph the Sweetling was the ambassador to the Iron Bank, or she had killed Harry Swift instead, it would have had a lot more influence on the plot, but it just doesn't. Yeah. So the only person that Raph the Sweetling really matters to is Arya. It's all, once again, inside Arya's little universe. Whoa. And I enjoy Arya's story and all the stuff that she experiences with like Goodheart and the elephant and the ships and learning, but she's mostly an observer to all this ancillary stuff that could be given elsewhere. And I really find it difficult to see like when her engine is finally going to get started. George has been struggling with her arc now for 16 years. It's old enough to drive a car, but its wheels aren't spinning. It can't go anywhere. These books are getting so long. I don't know what's going on.
For Arya's, well, that brings up a really interesting question and it's something, Aaron, you talked about in a post some months back, is George at this point where he's over this 1,500 manuscript page mark, and it's like trying to figure out how he can edit or cut down or split the story to where he can write 400 pages on Arya and write 300 pages on Bran learning about Green Sea, or write Sansa's really boring arc where she's having parties and that in the Vale.
Or as Michael and Matt would say, going back and rewriting these chapters all over again in order to get them to feed into the rest of the stories.
Right. And he doesn't want to split it again. He doesn't want to split it by location, so it's really tough, right? If you're George, you don't want to have another feast dance thing. I think he said that probably about a year ago. He's like, I do not want to split the narrative up again. But as you put it, you have 20 point of view characters, over 2,000 pages of material that you're trying to feed into a 1,500 page novel. That's difficult, right?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah. You can also see this as one of the failures of abandoning the 5-year gap. George has to continually send characters at Arya just to make her interesting. He's sending Aemon, he's sending Sam, sending Daron. Now he's sending in the Mercy chapters more and more people from King's Landing. These are characters he could have simplified. Like, they could have just had Sam and Aemon just end up at the Citadel. They didn't have to make this stop off in Bravos, but he wanted to because he wanted to see more Arya. And so in a way, his delay with Winds of Winter is, in these examples, you can see why it's happening. He has to keep inventing reasons for this stuff to happen that wouldn't normally.
And presumably, had we had the 5-year gap, you're not going to get that those moments of Sam and Aemon traveling to Bravos, even if they had, because we would just skip forward 5 years to when Sam has his bachelor's degree, maybe a combined bachelor's and master's in Maestery.
How many chains?
2 chains, and he has all the chains, and we can start getting to the plot of what has Sam learned in the Citadel that's going to be helpful in the War for the Dawn Part 2 Electric Boogaloo.
I think that's exactly right. I think Sam's one of the characters that got shortchanged the biggest by losing the 5-year gap. Instead of having time to learn anything, we're inventing reasons like he's going to find rare books, or he's going to like save some artifact from the Citadel to make his journey important, where he could have been a whole character at the end of this. So now
he's
that's kind of gone.
He's going to steal Heartsbane.
Yeah, something weird like that.
Yeah, exactly. Instead
of letting Sam become like a more confident, interesting character, he's just going to stay the way he is.
Let Sam be Sam again.
Well, here's right. Here's another aspect too. Returning to Arya, George has talked about that the Mercy chapter was one of his oldest chapters that he wrote, and he wrote the first draft of it before the split. So that chapter was completed in like 2001. So we're talking like
Oh my god.
13 years before the books even came out. And when you read the chapter, there was something that really...
That's 16 years ago.
I think I like Digimon at that point.
I was graduating from like elementary school.
I was a senior in high school, but let's not talk about that
Playing
right
your
now.
guitar. Here's Wonderwall.
playing Wonderwall. The thing about it is that some of the aspects of that chapter, when I read it for the first time, it really turned me off. And it was the very sexual nature of Arya's seduction of Wrath the Sweetling, which occurs at the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
When I read it, I'm like, dude, she's 12, man. She's 12 years old. But in a 5-year gap scenario, she'd be 17 or almost 18 years old.
Which is basically a femme fatale in Westeros.
Exactly, right? That's practically middle-aged when it comes to Westeros. I mean, not for real.
Lyanna was already dead.
Lyanna was dead, right? So that's something that really stuck out to me. But it's not all bad stuff, too, that George abandoned the 5-year gap. We're talking about all the things that really suffered. What happened is that he really struggled with 3 major areas. Dorne, Cersei and King's Landing, and Brienne's quest to find Sansa Stark.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't see how George accomplishes the things that he wanted to accomplish and things that he had foreshadowed in A Storm of Swords without abandoning the 5-year gap. Like, what does Brienne do for 5 years?
Well,
what happens in Dorne after Oberyn Martell dies?
The Dorne one, I don't have a good answer for you. But Brienne, on the other hand, I have a whole fan fiction written. No, I don't have a whole fan fiction written. No, but I think he could have hand-waved Brienne as going to Salt Pans, learning that Arya got on a ship headed across the Narrow Sea, and then Brienne spends several years bopping around the Free Cities, searching for Arya unsuccessfully. I guess it depends on where Sansa's story would end up, if she's also looking for Sansa, and maybe after 5 years Brienne would give up, and I can see how that would be a difficulty for George, but I guess I wouldn't have questioned it as a reader too much if he had made up some sort of plausible backstory about, and then Brienne sailed into the east for a while and wandered around having adventures looking for Arya and didn't find her. Although I would question Brienne's capabilities as a tracker.
Tracker in Essos?
Because 5 years, I mean, come on.
It would have been interesting, though, right? Thematically in the books to have Brienne going around for 5 years on this quest and failing at that quest. It would juxtapose nicely with Quentin's storyline of failed journey. You go there, you fail at winning the girl, you fail at getting the dragon and all these things. Same with Brienne. What happens to those people who never find the Holy Grail, who never find the lost princess?
It's Pelennor and the questing beast. That's like a classic trope, the knight who is constantly seeking the questing beast and cannot find it.
I think there's actually a kind of a Easter egg for where George would have left Brienne at the end of it. I think it's from the Windblown, Pretty Maris. Just read her description. She's near 6 feet tall and had blonde hair. She's earless with a slit nose and scars crossing both her cheeks. She's said to have cold, dead eyes and dresses all in mail. That sounds like Brienne after 5 years if she goes to Essos.
Whoa.
Yeah.
It sounds awful,
that
though.
disillusionment
Yeah,
and
it's
like
awful, but yeah.
this.
But that's probably where he's so sending her. Even the name, Brienne the Beauty and Pretty Maris, I mean, it's a pretty obvious connection.
The thing, though, is that kind of like turns me off to a 5-year gap is something that I love about Feast Dance is that it examines the impact of the decisions that characters and that nations made in the first 3 books and kind of says, hey, what is the impact of a huge continent-wide war which stretches from the north to Dorne?
Without all the same infrastructure that exists in our world and technology, things take a long time. 5 years is enough time, I think, to still like see those ramifications. You have these villages that 5 years later never recovered or might never exist
That's
anymore.
a great point.
You have 5 years of people being like, yeah, I lost these people that I loved, or maybe we'll cut this, maybe we won't, if it's too personal to say, but like when you joined the army, that was many years, and that had such a huge impact on you. That was many years after the September 11th attacks, and even so, like impacts and those effects can still be there.
The thing about A Song of Ice and Fire and my individual thing is that to capture that cultural zeitgeist, you do have to like pick up like on September 12th, 2001, like to really feel the impact of that. If you pick up in like 2006,
it's a different story.
Yeah.
It is a different story. It's a story that I don't know that is necessarily a better story than the one that we have right now. To take it away from like kind of that thematic and kind of letting the story breathe thing, like what does Stannis do for 5 years just sitting at the wall? What does Jon do? What are these characters that like are given these huge denouements from A Storm of Swords? How do they actually function for 5 years doing nothing? And what is the generation? What is the event that generates some sort of action that comes in what was then A Dance with Dragons before George split the narrative? Those are things that kind of keep me from going like, yeah, the 5-year gap it's really unfortunate that George abandoned that.
For Jon, in the last Maester month, we actually came up with a good one. 5 years after he's let the wildlings through. And then you pick up, like, as a major incident happens between them. Between, like, the wildlings that have now settled and the lords that are there. That could be a really good flashpoint to start from.
Yeah, and I think that actually Stannis was one of the things that George R. R. Martin brought up as to why he had to scrap the 5-year gap, because he doesn't know what to do with him. But, like,
right.
As Matt was saying, it suddenly starts to make more sense why there was such growing animosity between Jon and his men in the Night's Watch. If Jon is let through the wildlings, there's 5 years of tension between the wildlings with people in the realm, which not only antagonizes his own men, it creates friction between the Night's Watch and the rest of the Northmen, not just Ramsay,
right.
Because of everything. And then the men of the Night's Watch who have been there for a long time, they're like, this Lord Commander has endangered us in our position. And then all the consequences that lead to Jon's death suddenly make more sense, especially if you take into account, when I was in Balticon, I asked George R. R. Martin what his favorite Shakespeare plays were. He says Richard III and Julius Caesar. And in Julius Caesar, Julius is killed by his men for making decisions that they felt were harmful to their nation. And that's how the Night's Watch feel.
Right.
If you have that 5 years of political tension and violence.
Right, you don't need Jon making a huge mistake and reading out the letter in order to get him stabbed. You can set it up better with actually a 5-year gap by showing exactly how the tensions have built up and how his decision, which seems great at the time, has consequences. We don't see the consequences from Jon's actions yet. You sort of just get Bowen yelling at him. It'd be much more earned if you had a 5-year gap for him.
On the other hand, though, when you're relying on these sort of 5 years worth of things that have happened to affect people, that means you're relying a lot on either flashbacks or characters talking to each other about what has happened over the last 5 years.
It's a real problem.
And that's pretty static in terms of a story. What George R. R. Martin mentioned with Cersei and King's Landing, like, he kept running into Cersei flashing back to that time she killed somebody 5 years ago or 3 years ago or whatever it was.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just turning into, like, the Cersei flashback book. And there was no actual forward motion.
For Daenerys, who's been absent from our talk so far, George had written one chapter that was supposed to be Dany's first chapter that was supposed to pick up after the 5-year gap. And that chapter was actually Daznak's Pit, where Drogon returns. Dany doesn't fly away on top of Drogon at the end of the chapter. He apparently comes and kills a bunch of people, to include Bursina and all those the pit fighters and things like that, but there's no mention of her flying away, at least in terms of like fan rereadings. But I think that he restructured it to make it a really thematically and narratively great chapter, to make it so much more about the Drogon's return as symbolizing Dany's return to a draconic state, and symbolizing how she's leaving Meereen and embracing her dragon at the same time. And that's a really cool way that George ends up rewriting something that was originally envisioned and written before the 5-year gap was abandoned, and making it so much better, in my opinion, without the 5-year gap in mind.
I agree with that. Dany's chapters at the end of A Dance and Dragons, I don't know about you guys, I was getting bored with the politics in Meereen, and when she goes off and she starts getting she starts getting back in touch with Drogon, and you start seeing her moving to a different scene, I was really happy about that.
So speaking of dragons and Dany and all that, and we also mentioned Dorne earlier, There's one character whose story I think just wouldn't really work with a 5-year gap, at least not in the way it exists now, and that's of course Quentin Martell, my prince,
the greatest point of view character.
Yes,
my Silver Prince too.
He's my Mud Prince. You know what?
Your Frog Prince.
I don't see how that would work. I guess with the 5-year gap, given that part of what makes his story strong in Dance is the journey to get to Dany, and you get the idea that if we're picking up 5 years later, it's just hard to see how Quentin's story of traveling to Meereen and releasing the dragons and dying fits into this 5-year gap structure. Like, does he just sit around for 5 years before Doran sends him? Does he take a really long time to sail to Meereen?
Yeah, I assume it's exactly the way that it came out. The convenience of Quentin's storyline is that we are never introduced to him until the 5th book, and before that he's doing whatever in the Free Cities, so we can so Quentin's storyline can still be literally exactly the same even if there's a 5-year gap.
Yeah, okay. So like just Quentin is hanging out in the Free Cities for 5 years, quote unquote. Well, maybe
yeah, his parents are divorced and he's hanging out. He lives with his mom. His father has...
That sounds about right.
What is that called?
Gout.
Has custody of his sister.
Oh,
and that's
custody.
Just how it works.
But here's the thing about that is that Quentin's story is set in motion before Oberyn Martell is killed at the end of A Storm of Swords. The problem is that narratively, though, that event feeds into Doran's we've got to hurry the F up and get the Targaryens back to Westeros as soon as possible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know it works well to have Quentin kind of putz around in like the Free Cities for 5 years or hang out with Malario and Norvos or do whatever. And that's something that takes us into like what exactly did George plan with a 5-year gap in mind?
Right.
And something that's interesting is that George built a significant amount of foreshadowing into A Storm of Swords of plot lines that he seemed to be envisioning for what was then A Dance of Dragons 5 years later. And one of those was the Queenmaker plot, because who talks about the Queenmaker plot in A Storm of Swords with Syrian?
Syrian?
Who talked Syrian? Right.
Syrio Montatus?
Cyrano de Bergerac.
Exactly.
I need to delete my account now. One of the things that Oberyn talks about with Tyrion in A Storm of Swords is the Queenmaker plot, which is to crown Myrcella as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. Is that on hold for 5 years? I don't know that at least Dorne, as we come to know it in A Feast for Crows, would have been okay with just waiting around while people kind of got themselves into the places they wanted to be at. But you have other things.
Arianne wasn't going to wait.
Yeah, Arianne wasn't going to wait. The Sand Snakes were definitely not going to wait. And they're introduced at least they're mentioned in A Storm of Swords as well.
Well, you can mess with the ages, though.
I, as a reader, there had been a 5-year gap, would have bought it. That, okay, yeah, Dorne waited 5 years, whatever. But I think it makes more sense to have this immediate reaction to Oberyn's death. I think it carries more emotional weight than this sort of, and then 5 years passed because the author decided there were 5 years that were going to pass.
It also could be, too, that there's some sort of bias built into my perspective because we have a published Feast for Crows and a published Dance with Dragons, so we know what Dorne is like, whereas George could have made Dorne into whatever he wants to be.
Exactly, yeah, right. Like maybe he could have decided the Sand Snakes aren't as rash as I maybe thought, that they're going to take 5 years to make this little plan or whatever.
And then you get Myrcella grown up. She can actually be a part of it instead of a pawn.
Ooh.
Oh.
Now this is the part of the 5-year gap stuff that I love, is the fan fiction element of it.
What did we miss? My favorite fan fiction that we missed is Edric Dane. He obviously got replaced with Darkstar because he was going to be nowhere near in time for this. Edric Dane coming back to Starfall.
You say Edric?
Ned Dane, whatever. I call him Edric in my head.
I say Edric.
Well, okay, so
Edric.
One of the things we miss out on is...
You say Edric Storm?
Yes. Is Ned Dane, who gets replaced with Darkstar. We would have not had Of the Night. How great would the books be without that line?
They would have been less good.
What if Edric Dane becomes
Yeah.
of the night?
Oh my god, it's amazing.
That's
Because
right.
eventually the day turns into night.
Dark
time.
Star.
Oh, you guys.
My God.
He was born in the day of the Brotherhood without banners, but now he roams the night.
The fallen star.
Yeah, like
Dark
he
Star.
saw
like,
the night of
Oh my
man's soul.
gosh.
I don't think you follow an undead for 5 years and become of the day.
That's a good point. But see, that's another story that feels like it demands like immediate action. It's just, I guess I would have bought it, but like this undead revenge ghost monster woman sitting around for 5 years, or like doing small things for 5 years and then suddenly deciding to do one big thing once the story picks up again. It's just kind of
Right.
How do you end A Storm of Swords with that epilogue and then say, you know what, we're gonna skip a bunch of stuff now. We're gonna fast forward through the next bit.
She's just hanging out. Nothing really happens.
Hanging out, hanging because she
Just hanging.
you know, because she hangs people.
We did the same thing. That was amazing.
Hung out.
We've been talking a lot about like the negatives of the 5 years gap. What are your favorite things that we missed? What would you have liked to seen as a result of the 5 year gap?
George has talked about that Bran's storyline would have picked up after the 5 year gap with his Green Seer ceremony, or his induction into the Green Men or something. It seems like there's something like that. That's something that I think was put off to the Winds of Winter. Man, I really would have loved to have seen Bran pick up there. But then again, you know, gosh, guys, I was listening to some of our friends in the Davos Fingers podcast, and they just did Bran's second chapter from A Dance with Dragons, and it's such a great, spooky, horror action-filled chapter that I'm okay with getting the Children of the Forest and getting Bloodraven saying, Bran asking if he'll walk again, and he says, you will never walk again, Bran, but you will fly. Like, such a great chapter ending, and it's something we would have never gotten with a 5 year gap.
That's true. Michael, what about you? What's something you would have liked to see?
I think really Arya.
You could probably see, though, that he rolled some of that into Asha's POV. That's Asha's probably what Arya would have been like. Similar attitudes, the way she is confident. Sounds a lot like a 17-year-old Arya.
That's kind of interesting. I never would have thought of that. Yeah, I wonder if we would have even gotten Asha as a point of view after 5 years.
What would he have done about the Kingsmoot?
So the
Ooh.
Kingsmoot happens in A Storm of Swords. So
Yeah,
in
that's
a,
the
Euron.
but
I mean, his original plan was that gigantic prologue that included the Kingsmoot and some Dorne stuff
Oh, yeah.
too, right? I mean, that was part of his original plan, right?
it was, but I think it was after he abandoned the gap. He wrote this huge prologue of all the Dorne and Ironborn chapters, and released all the Ironborn chapters in 2002 in a book in a magazine. I can't remember the magazine title, but the novella was called Arms of the Kraken.
Were there any other arcs we missed?
We would lose all of Jaime.
Yeah, I would hate to miss Jaime's chapters.
Like, if we got a flashback of Jaime's journey through the Riverlands, I would be pissed. That would be such a cheat of such a great story.
Yeah, right.
And also, like, the other aspect to that Jaime that's really cool is where Jaime's standing vigil over Tywin's corpse, which is a great and really fabulous way that George told that of Jaime fluctuating between his guilt and his memories of his father and his thoughts towards Tyrion, and interspersing that with she screwed. We can't do this freaking explicit label.
She made the 8.
She did it like they did it on the Discovery Channel.
Whoa. That's a reference.
Now that you mentioned Jaime, Cersei also, that her first chapter, the morning after Tywin dies, like that's a great lead-in.
Fair,
It's a
true.
great start to the book,
True.
and you would lose that jumping forwards.
That would be a shame to lose.
The other thing I think would also be lost too is what does, returning to Daenerys, she starts receiving word at the end of A Storm of Swords that a Dothraki Khalasar has been summoned by the Yunkai to come down on her.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take 5 years for a Khalasar to come from Vaes Dothrak down to Meereen.
Right.
It would seem weird to suddenly have at the end of 5 years, they are finally here and they're finally doing something. I think the Battle of Fire, which still has not happened yet in the published books, was supposed to be in mind for the original 5 year gap. And I think that George kind of solved this problem in a really interesting way in that he invented all of these sellsword companies that we had never heard about previously. The Windblown, the Company of the Cat, the Long Lances, so that the Yunkish would still have the ability to fight and besiege Marine. Whereas after 5 years, they could train an army. They can have an army ready to go after 5 years.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I don't mind having the Tattered Prince as a character as a result of abandoning the 5-year gap, because I think he's fantastic.
There's a lot that can be said about the 5-year gap, because ultimately it's full of possibilities.
5 years of possibilities.
5 years of possibilities. But I think in the end, we're all pretty thankful for the story we ended up getting. I think that's fair to say, right? In terms of coming to a consensus.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Yes, because this story has brought all of us together, and now look at this beautiful friendship.
Exactly.
Matt,
That was beautiful, Eliana.
Well, thank you for listening, guys. This has been another great episode. I am one of your hosts, Michael, also known as Bookshelfstud.
And I have been another one of your hosts, Eliana, also known as Glass Table Girl.
I've been your third host, JoeMagician, also known as Matt.
I've been an undistinguished guest known as BryndenBfish, and as always, it's a pleasure to be a part of.
And there might have been some other voices that popped up in and out of the podcast, including Aaron, a.k.a. AdmiralKird, and Sam, a.k.a. Sam R.
His pseudonym's great.
Woo!
Thank you guys so much for listening to Maester Monthly. We really enjoy making it, and as always, also a big thank you to our tireless editors, including Aaron and Sam, who have to sit through just an enormous amount of guff.
And then thank you, of course, to all of you on the subreddit, because we don't have anything to talk about if you guys don't talk about things. So keep talking about things. See ya on the flippity flop.
Unlike, unsubscribe.
Okay. Yeah, smash that MF and like button. All right.
Report us for copyright infringement.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Should we actually say that, like, seriously? Like, remind people
Report
to
us?
subscribe
No.
and like.
Subscribe. You guys really should. You guys should say something about subscribe, and if you really like the podcast, write a review for us, because the way that people will find us will be by reviews, and if you see reviews, then it's going to be something that maybe people will see, and you guys out there in the Reddit community, you'll get to see your own posts possibly popping up and becoming popular and blowing up, and you never know. Some of these big fan sites tend to link, as in steal content from Reddit.
This could be the way you get famous. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. Maester Monthly, you heard it here first. So yeah, please, if you like what you hear, leave us a nice comment or review, share it with your friends. Smash that like button. Subscribe. You can subscribe on YouTube. I think we're on Google Play now as well, and iTunes. So there's plenty of mediums. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter for the incredibly hilarious antics that we all get up to. We're just absolutely mad. We're totally nuts. You wouldn't believe the kind of goofy we get up to. So we will see you guys on the flappity flop. I'll see you guys on the flippity floop.